here. I'm your host, Chayse Leavitt, and today I'm honored to be joined by two school board candidates here in Utah, Natalie Cline and Monica Wilbur. Thank you two for coming on.
Oh, thanks so much for having us, Chayse.
Of
Excited to
course.
hear this.
Of course. Natalie, we'll start with you. Can you just give a background about who you are and why you're running for the state school board?
Sure. I ran for my first term in 2020, but I first decided to run for the board after watching education policy after coming back from the United Nations in 2015, where I saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears the plans that they had for education globally and how they planned to get it down into every classroom in America, and their determination, their pledge to do so, and to not stop until they had gotten that water to the end of the road down to every child. That included a lot of the LGBTQ indoctrination. That was the main thing. I learned about critical race theory later. I knew instinctively that there was a huge threat to our faith, to our family, and to our freedoms here in America. And the more I've learned, the more that concern has been solidified. And now that I've watched for the past 3+ years, this movement into our schools, it's been alarming. And I think everybody in the state has come to see some aspect of it in their child's education. And so even the legislators, have become very concerned, such that they have tried passing different laws to stop it and resolutions. And so far, nothing's really done the trick because of the nature of CRT and its the way it manipulates the language and deconstructs our systems.
Okay. Would you like to introduce yourself, give us some background and why you're running for the state school board?
I'm a former English teacher, a former debate coach, a homeschool mom, and I got involved in all the stuff that's going on with schools right now, in part due to Natalie Cline. I remember listening and seeing what was being said about her in the media and in the news and media and at the state board back in 2021 when she first got on the board. And it really kind of surprised me. I was a little bit shocked to see the public reaction to words that she was saying that they were, to me, common sense. We have to get these indoctrination programs and practices out of the schools. And, as a parent with kids in the system at the time, I'm like, oh, absolutely. Like, she's totally speaking sense on this. So I was able to actually meet Natalie, and then we just kind of formed this working relationship. And it's led to us forming a website called higherground.work. We put a lot of our research on there. We've worked on policy together, education policy, and on informing and warning parents about a lot of these bad education trends that are filtering from the schools into our homes. And it's really just very important that we protect our kids. Like, they are the future. I know it sounds trite, but it's really true. And it's something that's really close to my heart as well.
What is the biggest issue you see within our education system here in Utah, whether it be just the way it's set up, whether it be CRT, whether it be the woke indoctrination, whatever it may be? What is that number one thing that we need to fight? Natalie, if you want to start with that.
Sure. So it's a huge problem. And we often call it a wicked problem, one that is overly complex, not fully solvable. There's many complicated parts and pieces to the system that are layered upon each other, such that it creates a resilience to change. And one of the reasons we created higherground.work was to try to kind of simplify the complexity of these problems in a way that is manageable for people to quickly get up to speed and understand the different pieces and parts of this very complex system. So I highly recommend people go there, because we are only going to be able to barely scratch the surface today, because there are so many pieces and parts, because we have legislators more and more trying to tackle legislation to fix these problems, but they don't always hit it right. In fact, they usually don't get it quite right, because the system is set up to find loopholes and exploit those loopholes. And so unless and until we have legislators that are willing and courageous enough to write really tight legislation where the language can't be subverted and where it has teeth, so that activists within the system don't just laugh at the legislation and do it anyway, because there are enough of them that they can simply band together and refuse to follow the law. And when there's as many as there are, what can the legislature do, right? To stop it? We've seen this with like the bill that was passed to get pornography out of the schools, right? It's twice now they've passed the bill. This last session, the second iteration passed because the first iteration was it just didn't do anything to get it out, because there are those within the system that are hell-bent on keeping it in. And so they will find a way. Where there's a will, there's a way. And so until we at the policy, those of us that are policymakers, understand the nature of the battle that we are in, and we write language in such a way that it actually does something instead of just looking like it does something or sounding like it might do something, we're going to continue to spin our wheels.
And Monica, you mentioned you were a former English teacher. When you were a teacher, what problems did you find? What did you find, and what will you do on the state school board to fix those problems?
Okay. Well, first of all, it was a while ago. It was over 2 decades ago. So the system was very different from what it is right now. Some of the problems that I think have carried over from that time, however, just some of this indoctrinal thinking. As a teacher, I was actually trained in DEI before it was called DEI. And that's, dating back to the late 90s. Standards were a relatively new thing as far as being implemented in the class. That's when we start to see a little bit of loosening of student discipline and an increase in kind of like passing kids along promotion, social promotion, where they might not have had the grades, but teachers were being kind of pushed to make sure that they got passing grades so they could, go through the system. But it was very different back then. I wrote my own curriculum. There's no money in that for large companies, for outside organizations when teachers write their own curriculum. And so that's been systematized, that's been standardized, it's been taken out of many of the teachers' hands. So how I would fix these problems. The problem is we don't have a strong foundational focus on those academic fundamentals. We've really shifted away from those. And I believe a lot of teachers feel like they kind of have free reign to share their personal lives and their political views in the classroom as a part of, broadening kids' view of the world. I don't think that's appropriate. So that's the first thing I would do, is kind of restore this foundation, this focus on foundational academics. And that's sorely needed at the board. We have a lot of policies and programs and practices that have expanded the scope of public education beyond what is appropriate, where they're taking over many of the roles that parents have traditionally filled. That's another thing that needs to be fixed. A school system that tries to be everything to everyone really doesn't do anything well. And that's a huge problem.
Right. I completely agree. I couldn't have said that better. Those are all problems that need to be addressed. And Natalie, I want to ask you, what things did you accomplish your during this term that you're in right now? And what things do you look to continue to accomplish if you're elected to another term?
So I've worked really hard at a primary focus of mine has been to educate parents and my constituents on the different trends that I'm seeing, the different policies, the workings of the system, so that they can, I strongly believe that if families have good information, they can make better decisions for their children. But the system has been set up to not be very transparent to the average individual. Our state code says that the parents are the primary educator in their child's life, and that schools are to be secondary and supportive of the parents. But when there is no transparency or understanding of how the system works, it makes it very difficult for parents to actually have a meaningful say in their children's education and to be able to, navigate the system in a way that is productive to getting their needs and their child's needs met. I've brought attention to the issues of CRT and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all the euphemisms that it goes by in the education system. It's like a whole new language. And many of them are euphemisms for these agendas that are being put in place. And so trying to shed light on what these terms really mean so that parents can be speaking the same language when they approach their teachers and administrators with their concerns. Social emotional learning has been another big one that I tried to bring attention to, as well as the system's version of social emotional learning, the state level portrait of a graduate, the state's cookie cutter plan for ensuring that all students graduate with certain competencies, which you would think that would mean academic skills and abilities, but it's what they call the soft skills or the life skills or the 21st century skills or workplace skills. And they are the more subjective kind of attributes that sound really great, that parents want their kids to, every parent wants their child to be more responsible, more resilient, more creative, all of the more empathetic, all of these things. But what parents don't understand is that these words don't mean, when the system uses these words, it means something very different than what parents think they mean. And so, bringing attention to the fact that we have an ESG or an environmental social governance kind of system embedded into our education system. The SEL is the framework of the different, the ideals that the system is trying to shoot for. And the PCBL is how they quantify and measure what's in the portrait of a graduate. So it's the system judging you not on your academic ability and skill, but your subjective character traits based on the system's definition. And if you do well at falling in line with these subjective agendas around more woke ideologies, racial, environmental, social, economical, and environmental justice ideologies, then you will do well you will score well on your personalized competency-based learning. And so this is more of a, again, like Monica mentioned, we have shifted hard away from objective academics, reading, writing, science, history. None of those mean what we think they mean anymore, because they've all been embedded with these other social emotional learning competencies, and that's what's being scored, and they've got a transcript for them now. So I was able to, make a motion in one of our board meetings to withdraw the board's support of the Sharps survey, as it is highly problematic. Got, like 160 or 200 questions on all of your behavioral and psychological issues, right, to try to gauge where you are. But that data is then used and manipulated to push for more programs that move us further and further away from the academic focus. So we got that passed. So the state board no longer supports the SHARP survey, even though it's still given in all the schools because it comes through the Department of Health and Human Services directly to schools, and it's not dependent on the board's approval for it to be given. But I've worked on the standards, the social studies standards, the English language arts standards, the science standards, the career and technical education standards, to try to bring those back in line with an academic focus and get out the soft, squishy, subjective language around these social emotional learning competencies. And Monica and I also worked together to bring light to the issues of boys in girls' spaces and the new Title IX regulations or interpretations that are coming from the Biden administration, and how that is putting girls at risk in our schools, as well as we were able to co-author some legislation that passed a year ago, HB 348, also known in code as 53G 10205, to protect the rights of conscience. So students have protection in the moment when they are faced with these kind of ideologically driven curriculums and programs that violate their conscience or religious belief, or violate the rights of conscience or religious belief of their parents, so that they don't have to jump through a million hoops to simply refrain from participating in those things, so that it protects their conscience.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say thank you for all the work you've done so far. I mean, all of that's phenomenal. And you mentioned lots of times about having an academic standard for people to graduate. It's changed into these other ways that they're measuring people's intelligence or the way that they are, other than strict academics. And it reminds me of in Oregon, how the governor basically made it so they don't have to be proficient in math and reading and language arts, anything like that, just and so that they can pass high school. It's crazy, and I don't understand it.
Our proficiency rates have continued to take a nosedive, while our spending has continued to skyrocket. And yet we brag about our graduation rates being, between 88 and 98%, depending on where in the state you are. And so in spite of our, statewide proficiency scores in math, English, language arts, et cetera, being in the toilet, we are still graduating kids at super high rates. So you tell me, are we not doing the same thing as Oregon?
It sounds like it. I mean, and people look at Utah and they're like, we're a super conservative state. None of that stuff is happening. And when you talk about issues of CRT, that men and women's sports, they're like, look, that's not happening here, but it is. And
yes,
so
that's part of the system takeover, right? This is a global and national transformation of education, and it starts at the top. That's why when I went to the UN and I realized what was happening and how the UN was planning on getting this in every classroom in America. And I thought, how do they do that? Well, they find their ways through legislators, state legislators, or around them, whatever way they have to. We compare these systems to a tsunami. Tsunamis are able to break down barriers and flood everything, right? So you can't stop it. And that's the system. The education system is designed to break down barriers and to flood every corner with these agendas.
And Monica, I know school choice is kind of a polarizing issue for many people when it comes to Republicans versus Democrats on that issue. But can you talk a little bit about that, what your opinion is on that, and how you will help advance that or that throughout the state?
Absolutely. Okay, so school choice in theory is a wonderful idea if you have a free market, meaning that people can vote with their dollars and their feet and go freely to whatever type of education choices are available, whether they're offered by the government, which is public schools, charter schools, which are still government schools. I don't think a lot of people understand that that's what they are. They are government funded, and therefore they are still government schools. And so you have charter schools, and then you have private schools, right, which are privately funded, privately run, and then you have homeschooling, and then a variety of homeschooling, micro schools, pods, etc. The basic premise behind school choice is that, and this is something the public really needs to understand, is that whatever government funds, government controls. So we now in Utah have government funded school choice options, meaning Utah Fits All. That's the program where they offer up to $8,000 per child to take advantage of, private market options. As Ann Milner up at the Utah State Legislature said, there is nothing that we do up here on the Hill that doesn't involve accountability. And they need to account for all that money given, all the money that is spent, every penny. So this isn't going to be just kind of like a free for all. It's not going to be a free lunch for parents. If they're giving families $8,000 per child, maybe the restrictions will be, or the regulations will be a little loose to begin with, but those will inevitably tighten up as they account for learning and for the spending of the dollars and the learning that's done underneath those dollars. So all we have done is really achieved kind of like a capturing of the private market now. I've already heard from private school owners who are very concerned because they've had parents coming and saying, hey, will you accept the Utah Fits All money? But in order to accept that money, you as an institution, once you accept even a dime of that money, if you haven't been accepting any sort of government funding up to that point, that puts you on the hook for government regulations and for complying with government regulations for every student in your school. It's not just for the one student who comes to your school. You're on the hook for for complying with government regulations for all those students. And they will insist upon accountability. They'll want to know what that student is learning, and that'll take the form of it's called a digital, backpack, right? And so basically a portfolio that the students will have to submit to show, this is what I have been spending on, this is what my learning consists of, and that will only expand. School choice is a lot more complicated than people think, but the goal is to get as many people hooked on the money as possible. And then what that does at that point is it makes all these formerly independent institutions now dependent on the federal or the local funds for school choice, but they're on the hook for both state and federal regulations. And then it's just the public system, essentially carried out by private institutions. It's quite an interesting plan.
We got a few minutes left here. I just want to ask each of you to take like about a minute each. What's your message to Utah, and then where people can follow you stuff. Natalie, if you want to start us off.
I know a lot of people need the system or feel that they need it, that they don't have other options. And so for those that are in the system, they need that help, and they need a voice from somebody like me that will share their concerns and look for ways to address those concerns, whether they're teachers or parents or students. In fighting for the students of Utah, I want them to be free to protect their own consciences and not to feel like they have to give up that essential liberty, that essential part of who they are in order to be able to graduate and to succeed according to the definition that the system has for success. I believe there are other definitions of success that families and students adhere to that don't necessarily match that of the system. And I think they should be free to decide on their own futures and to think their own thoughts and to learn untethered from tech and not be data mined and surveilled at every turn. I think students should be free from a system that seeks to indoctrinate or put divisive labels on them. I will continue to fight, as I have, and take the arrows for doing so in order to protect children against this tsunami of systems that are actively undermining faith, family, and freedom, including systems that seek to transform students' mindsets, attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors through social, emotional, and psychological and behavioral conditioning that seek to erase children's sexual inhibitions and boundaries and confuse them about biological reality. Systems that seek to control student outcomes through standardization. Systems that seek to outsource decisions on children to so-called experts rather than to parents. And systems that seek to exploit children for political, sexual, social, environmental, and economic agendas. And lastly, I'm working to protect our schools from becoming our social welfare centers that seek to provide everything to every child, and in so doing usurp the role of the family and make families and the rising generation dependent on government instead of becoming self-reliant and able to think clearly and chart their own course. I think a good education system helps children love what is good and beautiful and right, and gives them the freedom to follow their conscience and decide what success means for them.
Thank you, Natalie.
Yep, you can visit my website at nataliejcline.com. Also, again, you can go to our webpage, higherground.work. That's WORK, takes work to get to higher ground, to learn about the systems that have been corrupted and that are seeking to take your child to a certain destination that may or may not be where you want your child to end up.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. With the last minute here, Monica, if you want to give us your message to Utah.
I agree with everything Natalie says there. These are much needed changes that our system must be making. Because I've seen a lot of these bad global and national agendas that have come down and are being facilitated by the State Board of Education. So they're coming from the top. And I believe the state is standing in the way of students becoming the inspired and informed and independent and intelligent individuals that they deserve a chance to be. So it's very important that people are aware and aware of all these agendas that are coming through the schools and how they affect their kids at the very ground level. Just for instance, my own children, their high school has a proficiency rate of 10% in math. That means 10% of the kids can do math at grade level, whereas they are graduating almost 80% of the students. And the scores aren't that much better for reading and writing at grade level. 20% of the kids are proficient at grade level, and yet again, they're graduating almost 80% of the kids. This is not okay. And we are shortchanging our children to serve a system that isn't serving them. And we need a course correction, and it needs to start at the top. And we need people willing to say the hard things and to take the hard stances in order to make it happen. So my website is monicawilbur.com, and you can see much of my work along with Natalie's at higherground.work.
All right. Thank you, Monica. And thank you to both of you for taking the time to sit down and talk with me. I've loved it, and I wish you both the best of luck